Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our truly global audience, and welcome to this session of Business Breathers, a live webinar series hosted by Goodman Group at Brock University. My name is Abdul Rahimi, and it's my distinct pleasure to serve as the director of Goodman Group in the Goodman School of Business. Goodman Group, as many of you would know, is a community-focused learning and development services provider that works to support professionals, businesses, and entrepreneurs pursuing growth through accredited professional development certificate programs, executive education, consulting services, and startup support. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you, the over 300 registrants, to this session from all corners of the globe. We have had over 20 countries, representations from over 20 countries who are joining us to today's session. As you take a break with us by taking part in this webinar and this webinar series. This series aims to provide 45-minute breathers filled with insightful discussions on timely topics that are relevant to businesses and everyday lives, led by award-winning Brock University faculty and leading industry experts, encouraging thoughtful debates and keeping us feeling connected all together. This webinar series is hosted on Wednesdays from 11 to 11:45. In a moment, I will hand the screen over to today's webinar lead, President Gervan Fearon, who will lead today's discussion on the topic of corporate social responsibility in the era of Black Lives Matter. Just a pause to check on our format. Dr. Fearon will speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll spend some time answering your questions. You may pose your questions at the time of registration. Many of you have done so already. Thank you for all of that. You can type your questions into the chat feature, which is live and is open now. And you may also tweet your questions and comments live at GSB Goodman Group, all one word. Later, towards the end, I will provide instructions and details on how you may access today's webinar recording as well, for those who may not be able to view this here or want to refer to this later. Now, it's my distinct pleasure to welcome today's webinar lead, and that is Dr. Gervan Fearon, who is passionate about the role of post-secondary education in supporting regional development and has served on numerous community boards and helped champion significant community development initiatives. He received his PhD in economics from the University of Western Ontario and received his master's and bachelor's degree in agricultural economics at the University of Guelph. He also holds a chartered professional accounting designation and an Institute of Corporate Directors designation. Dr. Fearon came to Brock University from Brandon University, where he served as president and vice chancellor, and also as provost and vice president academic. Earlier in academic roles for Dr. Fearon included Dean at the J. Raymond Chang School of Continuing Education at Ryerson University, Associate Dean at York University's Atkinson Faculty of Liberal and Professional Studies, Visiting Scholar at the University of Washington, as well as Associate Professor at York University. He has authored and co-authored a number of papers, but he has been the co-author of a study that has entitled Perceptions of Toronto Police and Impact of Rule Changes Under Regulation 58-16, a community survey final report which was published in May 2019 and submitted to the Toronto Police Services Board and Police and Community Engagement Review Committee in Toronto, Ontario. He also has served as the former president of Tropicana Community Social Services in Toronto, and is also currently serves as on the Community Safety and Wellbeing Planning Committee for the Niagara region in Ontario. Besides his academic achievements, his career includes several years in Ontario government and in multiple roles, including senior analyst at Treasury Board Division, Ontario Ministry of Finance, and an executive assistant to Deputy Minister at the Ministry of Agriculture, Food, and Rural Affairs. His awards include many, and they also include the ones that have been given out by Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal for Community Engagement, the M. Jean Foundation Influencer Award, presented at the National Black Canadian Summit, Community Award, Excellence in Education for Jamaican Canadian Associations, the African Canadian Achievement Awards, Excellence in Education Awards, Toronto Police Services Community 13th Division, presented at the British Methodist Episcopal Church, and the Marcus Gravy Memorial Award for Community Service, Plant Africa Television and Magazine in Canada. His research is published in several journals, including Canadian Journal of Economics, Journal of Public Economics, and Industrial Relations Quarterly. Gervan, I don't know how you find time for all these, but we're very eager to hear your presentation and your thoughts on this very important matter. And thank you for being here today. Welcome, Gervan.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and as well, thanks to the entire audience who, as you made mention, is joining us from around the globe to engage not only in the outstanding work done at our Goodman School of Business here at Brock University, but engage in a key role of the university in ensuring that the university engages in relevant and timely dialogue on topics of interest across the country and indeed across the globe. So with that, I'm very pleased to be a part of the entire series, as well as very pleased to have the opportunity to do the presentation today. With that, I'll be turning to the presentation and taking us through a number of slides. I will actually only touch on the highlights of the slide to preserve a fair bit of time for dialogue at the end in terms of questions and answers that may come from the audience. So with that, for those of you who are online, you will see me share my screen in a moment and set up the slides as part of the transition. So with that, thank you very much, and let's look forward to an informative and engaging dialogue as well through the presentation.
That is excellent, thank you.
So with this, I believe that we can all now see the slides that I'm sharing, and just confirming that that's available to everyone.
It is, thank you.
As again, I'd just like to welcome everyone who's online and participating in the Business Breathers event that's hosted by the Goodman School of Business here at Brock University. Fundamentally, our topic today is corporate social responsibility in the era of Black Lives Matter. And as mentioned, not only do I have the distinct pleasure and privilege of serving as president of Brock University, but I've also participated in a number of community organizations, as well as with a number of different contexts, taking a look at both policing, but how does community development and how does the role of different institutions play into supporting community development. And in that respect, I think the Black Lives Matter movement is particularly relevant to the general themes that's been brought to the forefront in discussions through the Goodman School of Business and through the series. So in that, it should be noted that there'll be three areas that I'll be covering in our discussion. We'll talk a little bit about board governance. We'll talk about social movement and in particular Black Lives Matter. And then we'll also talk about the idea around social corporate responsibility as part of some of the learning outcomes and some of the discussion topics for today's talk. With that, I think all of us would emphasize within all of our organizations that the role of board governance is very material to the success of organizations, whether it's universities, whether it's for-profit or not-for-profit organizations. And the due diligence processes that boards undertake in order to ensure the alignment between the activities and the mission of the organization is fundamentally important. As part of that, I believe that we would also all share the idea that the role and responsibilities of directors on boards and implicitly then boards really fall into a number of key areas or key contexts. Duty of care. And this is without question that the idea that any reasonable, prudent person would exercise a duty of care in the kind of deliberations and decisions that they make at the board, and the skills and knowledge that they bring to board decision making. Fiduciary duty, again, another key responsibility of board members, and this is in the idea of acting in good faith in the best interest of the corporation. And what's interesting about that is that the best interest of the corporation, that pivots both between shareholders and stakeholders. And as we go through, you'll see how that becomes an important consideration when we want to start thinking about corporate social responsibility. Clearly as well, a fiduciary duty includes constructs around confidentiality. But as well include duty of loyalty and the desire to ensure that an individual brings to bear any conflict of interest. And then the idea of a business judgment and how that is exercised at a board. So in that respect, many boards and many directors of boards have this shared construct of the interests of shareholders, as well as the interests of stakeholders. And at times, the shareholders' interest as it relates to sharing in the profit or loss of the corporation is quite clear and at the forefront. But stakeholders, whether it's the employees, whether it's a community, whether it's individual organizations, lenders and funders of the organization or the corporation, are also important to the decision-making process of board members and the board and the corporation at large then. Well, it's in that setting that in many respects one can put corporate social responsibility. And the Canadian government has put out some statements as to their perception or guidance, one might call it, around corporate social responsibility. And at one level, some of these can be viewed as voluntary at times, but at times we also have to recall that stakeholders have a significant stake in the success or, in fact, failure of a corporation, but shareholders and stakeholders also play a role in societal matters, and stakeholders will also influence the governance framework under which corporations operate. And we can think back to the writing of Rousseau in terms of social contract, or maybe the more recent language used in the resource sector, which is social license, and that's often defined by stakeholders. In that context, of course, we know that stakeholders then also are voters. And that means that they'll influence both the policies, law, regulations, programs, and the likes for which corporations operate in. They'll also litigate. They'll also influence the constructs of consumers and brand statements of organizations. And consequently, while there is at times a dominance in terms of corporate governance, the idea of focusing on shareholder, what corporate social responsibility suggests is that taking a look at stakeholders and who are the stakeholders to our organizations become very material, along with the explicit and implicit social contracts and social license that's granted to the operations of corporations. That brings us to social movement. And we've all seen a range of social movement at a global level. And within the Canadian context, we've seen social movement, for example, amongst Indigenous communities and Canadian as a whole, looking at the kinds of society that we are trying to shape and our obligations, whether through treaty or through the Constitution, our obligations as all Canadians to Indigenous communities. And we have seen significant social movement coalesce around Indigenous communities across Canada. What we can say about social movement at a general level for a moment is that it actually often involves the idea of formation of coalition. It often involves the idea of developing what might be called a blocking or supporting coalition. And that also means that there's an interaction between stakeholders and shareholders, since shareholders may also be members of communities that can have significant influence on the corporation. We also know that social movements, whether it's the civil rights movement, whether it's the environmental movement, have resulted in significant policy, legal frameworks that's really defined and shaped the environment in which corporations operate in. And I'll move on this very quickly because I think we can all propagate our own examples. With that, moving to Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter has been a amazing movement in the respect that it's the coalescence and the coalition of individuals across a really wide geography. At one level, we might think simply the United States, but then we would test that and realize that Black Lives Matter has also been very influential in the Canadian context. And more recently, we've seen in the global context. And in general, the movement has been formed and catalyst has often been as a result of the interaction between members of the Black community and police services or police forces. And in that context, that interaction can be seen by poignant images such as this. And these poignant images really bring to bear the question as to what is the relationship then, in this case, between this individual, member of the Black community, and the police, and that relationship. And those images really define out. We can think of other images, whether it was around the Vietnam War, whether it was around the environment, images that stick in our mind that causes us to pause for that moment in history. With that, then, the more recent catalyst and image that we saw with the George Floyd image over 8 minutes at a time when there were a series of other incidences and a societal context that was really bringing into question the relationship between police and the Black community. And in that regard, one can say that the movement, at least in a number of items, let's just pick 3, was asking the question about the police encounters and outcomes as it relates to the Black community versus what might be a broader societal construct around justice as well as social justice. Similarly, the ideas around social exclusion versus social inclusion, systemic racism versus institutions that are responsive to all members of society. What's interesting about movements and Black Lives Matter is that simultaneously with the more recent incidences is a observation of essential workers because of challenges around systemic marginalization. A large number of members of the Black community, particularly in the United States, being essential workers and having then disparate health outcomes as it relates to COVID-19. the idea of what's called wage discrimination or occupational segregation that then results in individuals more likely to go out to work than stay home or staying isolated, housing, poverty, and transportation items. So what is interesting in that context is that at times movements coalesce with broader social events affecting a broader span of society, but the ideals that individuals are speaking towards, social justice, social inclusion, institutional responsiveness, become items that a single movement may be aspiring towards, but it resonates across a broader context of society. And in that sense, movements often have ideals that are shared with a broader sector of what might be called stakeholders of corporations. And in that regard, the idea of corporate social responsibility in the era of Black Lives Matter, then there is definitely a moment to reflect on the role of corporate responsibility in the era of Black Lives Matter. Well, when we start thinking about the idea of action in support of corporate responsibility, the obvious question is, how does it manifest itself? Well, I think it can manifest itself in terms of how we look at board composition, governance, inclusion. So that includes, for example, the strategic priorities established by the organization, the individuals around the table, how shareholders and stakeholder matrix, meaning looking at the different interests of different stakeholders and ensuring that the decisions of the corporation takes into account that stakeholder interests and shareholder interests may evolve over time and may evolve in response to the developments of movement. As you can see, there's a broad list there, but as well as it relates to the Black Lives Matter, what we know is that this is now a global movement speaking to the ideas of social justice, social inclusion, and the responsiveness of institutions to represent all members of society. More recently, we also know that the language of Black, Indigenous people of color, that context being a broader context that speaks to what previously have often been viewed as visible minority or marginalized communities, meaning that there's a coalescence of interest and a sharing of interest, particularly in the Canadian context. And that means that all the practices within a organization, within a corporation, we need to exercise critical thinking, critical analysis about our practices. Well, that is sometimes really hard. I think it's really hard for any corporation, any organization, let alone individual, to be able to ask themselves, do we have practices that exhibit systemic racism? And I believe that's a question that we all need to ask ourselves and ask of our corporations and organizations. But I'd like to do a little bit of a quick exercise here. And I think many of us, if you've interviewed or been offered a position recently, you might know that a question that often is asked is, can you tell me what your current salary is and what your current position? When you look at the Black community, the educational level of members of the Black community in the Canadian context is not dramatically different than that of the general population. However, there is a substantial earning gap between members of the Black community on average relative to the general population. And this was a study that was conducted. We conducted back in 2011 based on 2006 statistics with hundreds of thousands of data points from the census. And what was found was that even when you code for the education level, the skill level, the work experience, linguistic background, coding for that, meaning taking that into account. So for all intents and purposes, the individuals are identical on those parameters. There was a significant what's called wage discrimination, meaning you're in the same job but being paid less, as well as occupational segregation, meaning you have the same skill, but your position is less. And that tallies up just in a single year across the Black community of $1.5 billion each year. Meaning then that if by some chance you're basing a salary offer on the basis of the historical salary of an individual, there is likely that practice can bring into your organization a case of that the broader societal wage gap and systemic discrimination can now get infused within your practices. And as a result, in a number of jurisdictions in the US, they have actually looked at no longer permitting the idea of negotiating wages on the basis of past wages or past positions, but rather on the basis of the actual core competencies of success that the individual brings to the table. Well, what I would want to say and sum up and to leave time for discussion here is corporate social responsibility then is certainly a balancing act. It's a balancing act for corporations between shareholders' interests and stakeholder interests. But do remember, your stakeholders will define the social contract, social license, and many of the legislations that will come to bear. We can think of in the US and in Canada, for example, around a number of acts that were implemented. So the Americans with Disability Act of 1990, in Ontario, the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disability Act of 2005. Those were all legislations that was a result of social movement. And I believe today we would all say as members of society that we have benefited from those movements. The ramp that's available, I can recall some time ago, some of you at the university or in the community would have known that I was on crutches. I benefited from what we call in Ontario AODA, so the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disability Act during that period. So in some senses, movements, when we stand back and reflect, often benefits us as well. Next, I would say that it's not just about strategy, it is also about corporate culture. And it's not only about traditions, it's also recognizing social movements, and that often the goals of the social movement may be goals that we can all share, even if there are individually we might want to participate in the social movement in different ways and different forms than how other individuals may want to do that. So ultimately, I think that what this raises is really for corporations, for all of us in society, is how do we respond to the Black Lives movement, and how will we balance these developments in the context of emergent social change and social movement, and in the context of the topic of today, which is corporate social responsibility. So with that, as I turn out, I would just like to remind everyone that there will be an upcoming presentation on August the 12th. The topic is posted there. I believe our host will talk to that a little bit more. And with that, I'd like to remind us that this is brought to you by Goodman School of Business here at Brock University, facilitated by the Goodman Group, And what I'll also do is now turn the presentation off, as it were, and join you and turn you back to the host such that I can entertain your question and we could engage in some dialogue around this very important topic. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gervan, for that. That was very insightful in there. I see that you are entertaining your masters. I just wanted to bring my one up as well. The new fashion statement, of course, but it's ever so important. Very good. Excellent. We have received a number of questions, so thank you for that. And I will thank you to all of our audience for putting your questions forward. We'll strive to take as many of these questions as we possibly can in the allowed time. And so why don't I begin right off the bat with the first one here that we have received at the time of registration. How do we effectively identify systemic racism in our policies? And as a leader, how do we effectively identify our own biases?
Okay, thank you very much. I think that's the first one is, if I think of for boards or for organizations, to have the motivation to look at your policies and your practices, and then to be able to look at the impact of those practices across the organization, across different members of the organization, to be able to see if those policies are having a differential impact, and in particular, a differential negative impact on some groups versus the others, and as well as to engage individuals within the organization in that dialogue to get their input in that assessment. That can be done internally through one HR department or the like, or to be able to actually call in an external group or body to be able to assist with that. But I think being able to express the motivation to look at your policies and as well as to monitor on an ongoing basis the impact as well as the outcomes and the results that's being observed by the organization is certainly a first step.
Excellent, thank you. Here's the next one. How do you ensure that your statements and initiatives are not tokenized when responding to the Black Lives Matter movement or other social movements?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. And I would say that if one focuses on the efforts being in benefit of individuals, in benefit of communities, and in this case, as it relates to Black Lives Matter, in relationship to the Black community. But as I made mention, that language is also, in the Canadian context, in relation to Indigenous communities, Indigenous peoples, peoples of color. I think as you take a look at, are you making an impact in the lives and the outcomes in a beneficial manner to individuals, I think one then can point to the impact that you're having as beyond tokenism in that regard.
Excellent. Here's another one. What are the pillars of good governance in educational institutions, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think I'll pair that with the question that I just had in a moment, and I would say that I lived in Manitoba for a little while and served with the Brandon Urban Aboriginal Peoples Council, and the council and Indigenous communities in Manitoba used an excellent phrase meaning nothing about me without me. And I think as a context of good governance is that decisions are made by boards or by organization that if it's about someone, how are those individuals involved and engaged in the decision-making process all the way up and down the ladder? and how do the organization and the board monitor both achievements against the priorities that have been set. So for us at the university, we have an explicit priority around inclusion, around decolonization, around indigenization. How do we monitor and make sure that we're making progress against the very ideals that we have put forward?
Excellent. Here's another one that came through, and it's in the same line. What steps can we take to make our workforce more inclusive and diverse while still hiring the best for the job?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and I think one item is without question, all organizations want the best talent, the best individual to be able to succeed against the mission of the organization. And in saying mission, I'll give an example. If by some chance, for example, that we as an organization had privy over the space station, the International Space Station, as the best person designing spacesuits should be a person that would design spacesuits both for the men and women who will be going into space. If by some chance the person hired only designed spacesuits for men, then I would ask the question, did you actually hire the best person? And that means then that the mission of the organization, if by some chance the mission of the organization is serving all Canadians, then by definition, the qualifications required should include all Canadians, and one then should look at practices that for one reason or another doesn't permit or support all Canadians being qualified for that position. And that may also mean that if there are historical reasons, historical factors why individuals may not look at a profession, to make sure that companies are doing the outreach to those communities to make sure that they are aware of these opportunities, and that we're also taking proactive steps to create mentorship and internship programs and scholarships, and working with other organizations and community organizations to be able to ensure that there is a flow of individuals, because the success of Canada, and I think the success of humanity, especially in this time period of COVID-19, will be dependent on all members of society being able to develop their talent and bring their talents to the success of organizations and to Canada as a whole.
Excellent. And I think it's right to say that Brock University has taken a number of initiatives around this area, including the recent announcement for Black and Indigenous folks for scholarship opportunities of $1 million for students and graduate students to support their initiatives, is one of the many initiatives that's currently underway under your leadership at Brock University. So
yeah, thank you.
For that. Here's another question that's come up. Could you speak about the relationship between anti-Black racism and anti-minority racism, especially in the light of the rampant increase in Islamophobia? How do we marry these movements together?
Yeah, I think that and it gets back to the idea of, I put up 3 points. One was social justice, social inclusion, and institutional responsiveness to the general population. In some senses, all of the items that you highlighted share the construct of that they're inconsistent with the principles of civil society and an inclusive society. So in some senses, they all share the common statement of being able to challenge us as individuals, as organizations, as to how do we contribute to the development of an outstanding Canada that is inclusive. So I think that's the points that are shared. I think the points that are different is the data that shows in the case of the study that we did in relation to the Toronto Police Services, that the incidence of individuals being stopped and what was colloquially called carded, that there was a almost a double probability of all things being the same. If you were Black, that you would be stopped, and Black male in particular. That means that in some sense, some cases, the incidence of events are higher for some groups versus other groups. I think Indigenous peoples and Indigenous communities across Canada have highlighted some of those considerations as well. So while there are common themes, I think that there are particular efforts that at times need to be directed and different supports that may be needed by different communities, even while the general theme is the same, meaning broader exercise of justice and justice, social inclusion, and the responsiveness of our institutions. We could all share in those priorities, but how that is exhibited for individuals or individual communities may differ. And the Black Lives Matter movement really speaks to a particular concern as it relates to the Black community in that context.
Gervan, thank you very much for taking this time out of your busy schedule and being here with us and in our audience and putting your opinions and thoughts forward, and also taking the time to answer the questions that came through at the time of registration, as well as those that came live during the session here. To our audience, thank you very much for the questions, for being here, for putting your questions forward. I know we weren't able to answer all of your questions, but went through and tried to answer the common thread that were coming through in here. So there's a number of other questions that have come through as part of that, and we will endeavor to bring you with further material to address those. In the coming days, I would like you to keep an eye out on your inbox, as you will receive an email with information on how to access today's resources, including the recording of this current session, which will also be made available on our website. But by virtue of being here, you get the opportunity to put your questions live and also access the material ahead of everybody else. Goodman Group Professional Development would also like to remind you that the Nonprofit Leadership Development Certificate Program, starting in October, is open, is accepting applicants and registrants for the program. The number of seats for that program have been limited to maintain a high quality of programming for the instructor-led sessions, and those seats are filling fast. So I invite you to reserve and register your seat sooner to ensure your spot. You may do so by visit the site, which is brocku.ca//Goodman Group, or you can contact me or any member of the team here at Goodman Group. As President Fearon has put up there, the next session will be on August 12th, August 12th, Wednesday at 11 to 11:45 again. And this would be on the topic of entrepreneurial leadership, thrive, not just survive the crisis, which is led by an award-winning professor of Goodman School of Business here, and that is Professor Shauna Chen, who will be leading that session. Until then, stay safe, and thank you.